Welcome to Dialogue. We are taking a deep and I think necessary look today at a year that, depending on how you see it, was either the peak of a decade of chaos or, maybe more accurately, just the moment everything became visible. We're analyzing a really comprehensive assessment of the year 2025, a period that gets labeled as the most intensely self-aware yet strangely static in recent memory.
It's a fascinating body of work to go through. I mean, the core thesis that you see running through all of this material is that 2025 wasn't the year system suddenly collapsed.
Right.
Rather, it was the year the cracks became impossible to ignore. So the prevailing observation isn't this catastrophic failure. It's that political, economic, and technological structures continued functioning exactly as designed, only now in full view of everyone.
That distinction is it's absolutely crucial. It changes the entire narrative, doesn't it? We move from a story of some kind of unexpected disaster to one of really excruciating transparency. The systems were working, but their purpose was suddenly revealed to be something other than benevolent. And you can feel the tone of collective disbelief and even a dark humor running through the period. There's a line in the analysis that just captures the absurd feeling of the year perfectly. It suggests reality was so unbelievable that satire officially retired because reality was working overtime.
That phrase speaks volumes about the cognitive dissonance of the time. Everything felt ridiculous, yet profoundly serious, all at once. What we're looking at is a moment of mass recognition where humanity became almost universally informed, but that awareness, it didn't translate into immediate, effective resolution.
So we knew everything was wrong, but didn't know what to do about it.
That's the paradox of 2025. We finally saw the mirror clearly, but the analysis frames it as the moment we collectively looked at the mirror and asked for a filter. Good quote. We wanted to observe the problems, but without having to live with the really difficult implications of actually solving them.
And that's really the mission of this deep dive. For you listening, we're going to break down how those global systems and this heightened collective psychology redefined the fundamental feel of everyday life. This isn't about just rehashing the 2025 news cycle, but about identifying the core, often unpleasant truths that were laid bare by that year, moving past all the surface noise to really understand the foundational shifts. So to begin this sort of structural diagnosis, we have to start with the internal state, the collective psychology. Burnout as the default state. And the core idea is pretty stark. Society entered 2025 already depleted.
Utterly depleted.
Overstimulated, hyper-aware. And burnout wasn't an exception to the rule anymore. It was the default emotional operating system.
And that's a fascinating normalization of systemic fatigue. I mean, think about it. Burnout used to be something you'd get after, a huge project at work or years in a really tough job.
It was an occupational hazard.
Right. But what this material points out is that in 2025, people were burned out before the workday even started.
Not just from their jobs.
No, not at all. It was from the constant cognitive load of everything else. Geopolitical news, tech updates, the nonstop moral churn of the content cycle. It was exhausting.
It creates such a fundamental problem for any kind of social change. If you are operating at, say, 20% capacity just to handle the basics.
Your job, your bills.
Where do you possibly find the energy for collective action, or even just for deep, critical thought about the institutions around you?
You can't. The resources just are not there. And this brings up a concept the material touches on called surge capacity.
Right. That's the emergency reserve of mental energy we have.
Exactly. When a crisis hits, a natural disaster, a personal loss, we tap into this reserve. It's focus, adrenaline, motivation.
Yeah. It's like when your phone hits 5% battery and you put it in that ultra-low power mode just to squeeze out a few more minutes.
That's a perfect analogy. But that surge capacity is finite. It's not an endless well. And when you live in a state of perpetual low-grade crisis,
constant doom scrolling, economic anxiety, social media pressure,
your reserves never get a chance to refill. They're just constantly being drained by this background noise. And after a while, you can't even tell the difference between a real emergency and just digital friction.
So if everyone's reserves are gone, what does the system gain from that?
It gains inertia. The systemic fatigue itself becomes this incredibly powerful force for the status quo. Bad systems thrive when people are just too tired to question them.
Too emotionally depleted to organize.
Or too overwhelmed to even imagine a complex alternative. The system doesn't need to go out and actively crush dissent if all the energy for dissent is already being consumed by the sheer difficulty of daily life.
So the exhaustion isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's structurally convenient. The only energy you have left is for immediate reaction.
Not sustained action. And that reactive energy, gets instantly vacuumed up and monetized by the platforms. It's a painful state to be in, to know the problem so intimately, to feel the injustice so sharply, but to lack the resources to do anything constructive about it.
And this feeds perfectly into the next point, the decontextualization of mental health language.
Hmm.
So on the surface, you see all this language entering the mainstream. Trauma, boundaries, healing, and it looks like progress.
Right. It looks like a society becoming more emotionally intelligent.
But the material is very clear. This language was often stripped of its depth. It was used more as a justification for behavior
Or inaction.
than for actual healing or for gaining any real wisdom.
It's a really profound shift in how language works. These were concepts that used to live in very specific clinical or academic settings. Suddenly they're everywhere. We all learn the
I
vocabulary.
could name our anxiety. We could describe a narcissistic dynamic.
We could talk about trauma responses. But that general awareness didn't automatically lead to better behavior or collective wisdom.
It's the difference between owning a map and actually knowing how to navigate the terrain. Everyone was saying they were doing the work.
Yes, the material jokes about that. Everyone was doing the work. But if you actually asked what that work was,
The answers got very vague.
very vague. It was often about self-care rituals that looked good on social media, not the messy, difficult process of actually changing a habit or resolving a conflict. The language became a performance.
I think the most pointed example they use is how the word boundaries got weaponized.
Oh, absolutely.
A concept from therapy that's fundamentally about self-respect and healthy relationships was twisted into this shield you could just throw up to deflect any and all criticism.
It became a get-out-of-jail-free card for avoiding difficult conversations.
Yeah.
If you can just label any challenge to your worldview as a violation of your boundaries or as a source of trauma,
Then you never have to engage. You can just retreat into your fortress.
the language is used to prioritize your own emotional comfort over the very necessary and often uncomfortable work of being in a community with other people.
And you saw this everywhere online with amateur diagnoses. Complex political actors or social trends would just be slapped with a simplistic clinical label.
And that reduces everything. It strips out all the nuance.
It turns a tool for healing into a weapon for moral judgment. If you can just call someone's behavior a disorder, you don't have to actually engage with their argument or their perspective. The awareness of the term was high, but the wisdom of how to apply it was incredibly low.
And this hyper-emotional, psychologically armed landscape directly shaped how civic life worked. Which brings us to outrage versus action. Doom scrolling as performance.
Yes, the argument here is that consuming news in 2025 was less about gathering information.
And a lot more like watching a horror movie.
Exactly. It was like serialized horror entertainment. The whole environment was engineered for maximum emotional stimulation.
You weren't just getting facts and figures about a global conflict. You were being immersed in this high-intensity, constantly updating emotional drama. The algorithm's only goal was engagement.
And outrage is the highest octane fuel for engagement.
It's the most reliable. So the outrage itself became the currency. You'd get this little psychological hit, a jolt of moral righteousness, just by expressing your horror online. And that performance of concern often became a substitute for doing anything real.
It's that substitution mechanism. If you post a really passionate, well-worded critique of an injustice, you get the psychological reward of having done something.
You've discharged your moral duty.
Right, but it doesn't require any of the, the physical effort or the long-term organizing or the sheer administrative boredom of actual political work.
Think about the difference in energy. Writing an angry thread versus going to a 3-hour-long town council meeting.
It's not even comparable. We performed our moral concern. We doom-scrolled until 3 a.m. feeling awful about the world, but the physical world outside our screens didn't necessarily change.
And the system loved it. The platforms reward outrage because it's sticky, it's engaging. Real solutions. They're slow, they're nuanced, they involve compromise. That stuff doesn't go viral.
So the whole environment, the exhaustion, the performative psychology, it was perfectly primed for the huge shifts we saw in technology.
It's a seamless transition, really.
So on to AI. The central idea here is that AI definitively shifted from being a helpful tool to being a foundational structural force.
And that's the moment the nature of work just fundamentally changes. A tool, think of a calculator, a word processor. It augments what a human can do.
It helps you do your job better.
Exactly. But a structural force that reshapes the entire environment. It dictates the new terms of engagement. It redefines the very relationship between human labor and economic value. AI stopped being an optional utility and became mandatory infrastructure.
And this new focus on efficiency, on this mandatory integration, it revealed just how fragile modern employment had become.
And personal identity along with it, especially when the search for meaning gets pushed aside for pure optimization.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when a system's primary goal is optimization, anything that creates friction or variability, the very qualities that often define human originality and meaning, that stuff becomes a liability.
So when AI can replicate the standardized output,
The human element, the part that makes meaning, it loses its economic leverage almost overnight. Suddenly you're competing with a machine that works for free at a speed you can't even comprehend.
and we saw this displacement happen so fast, in creative fields, for example, which we always thought were uniquely human, writers weren't just using AI to help them.
No, they were being actively replaced by what the material calls prompt engineers.
And the prompt engineer is such a perfect example of how value gets transferred. The
Yeah.
skill is no longer about the decades of mastering craft and narrative.
The writing itself.
Right. The value shifts to being able to manipulate the input. The skill becomes translating a human desire into a language the algorithm can understand. The original act of creation gets devalued.
It's commodified instantly. And you saw the same identity crisis in the art world. Artists were literally arguing with algorithms about who owned what.
If an AI can generate a masterpiece in seconds by mashing up millions of human-made images, what does it mean to be a human artist?
It's an existential crisis.
Yeah.
The algorithm is just creating the most statistically perfect average of what it's been trained on. So the challenge for the human becomes, how do I create something genuinely unpredictable? Something the machine could never have come up with.
But while you're trying to figure that out, the economic floor has just dropped out from under you.
Precisely. And then there's the most mundane, but maybe the most soul-crushing example of this whole shift.
The HR rejection letters.
The automated, standardized, perfectly polite, and utterly impersonal rejection letters.
It's efficiency with all the humanity stripped out.
Completely. The rejection is automated, it's optimized to avoid legal risk, and it's designed to be emotionally neutral. But that's the problem. It comes from a process that feels nothing. There's no person you can appeal to, no feedback you can get. The door is just closed by a cold, efficient machine.
It's the illusion of professionalism papering over systemic coldness, which leads us to the next point. The illusion of control and the blame sponge. AI was sold to everyone as empowerment, a tool to make you more productive. But in reality, human oversight became more symbolic than anything else.
This is the critical piece. When AI becomes structural, it's managing things at a scale and speed that's way beyond human cognition. Supply chains, loan applications, you name it.
But when something goes wrong, society still wants a person to hold accountable.
Of course, you can't sue an algorithm. So who absorbs that liability?
The human supervisor, or as this material so perfectly calls them, the blame sponge.
The term human in the loop was everywhere in 2025. It sounded great, right? It promised ethical oversight, human control.
But in practice,
The material argues that the human's job was often just to click approve on a decision the machine had already made. They couldn't possibly vet that decision in the time they had.
the volume, the complexity, the opacity of the system, it's impossible.
So their real function was just to be the person who takes the fall when the system inevitably screws up.
I love the humor they use here. That humans were overseeing AI with the same efficacy as toddlers supervising forklifts.
It's funny because it's true. The process is too fast, the scale is too big, and the internal logic is a black box, often even to its creators. That human supervisor is just there to check a compliance box.
So we outsource the hard work to the machine.
And then we keep a human around purely to outsource the blame. We give them all of the responsibility with none of the actual authority or power to change the outcome.
And that's the signature move of this AI structural shift.
It's a way for powerful institutions to deploy this incredible technology while keeping up a comforting, human-facing facade of accountability. It lets the tech run wild because the blame is always deflected down to the lowest level human who can't do anything to stop it.
That transfer of complexity, that deflection of responsibility, it flows right into the state of politics in our institutions.
Absolutely. If AI optimized labor, it definitely optimized politics. And the material is chilling on this. The concept is titled Democracy as an Engagement Metric.
The core idea is that governance itself is basically replaced by engagement metrics. Political strategy wasn't about long-term public good anymore.
Not at all. It was about whatever drove the highest short-term reaction online. It didn't matter if that reaction was divisive or simplistic, as long as it got clicks.
So complex policy ideas got boiled down into viral hashtags.
You'd see these massive, complicated geopolitical or economic issues get distilled into a slogan designed to just ignite a 5-day outrage cycle. The goal wasn't to pass a law. The goal was to trend on social media.
And if your political effort didn't trend, it was like it didn't even exist.
It didn't, which forced politicians into this constant state of theatrical performance. They had to prioritize sound bites and controversy over the slow, boring, actual work of legislating.
I mean, why would you spend months hammering out a nuanced bill in some committee?
A process that is fundamentally boring to watch.
When you can spend 5 minutes and generate a viral firestorm over some minor cultural issue, outrage is immediate, it's satisfying, it's binary, you win or you lose.
But real governance is about compromise. It's incremental, it's messy. And in 2025, if you dared to suggest a middle ground solution, you'd be attacked by your own side for not being outraged enough.
Which was political suicide.
So the conclusion is that democracy wasn't overthrown in some dramatic coup. It was just content managed.
Hollowed out, repurposed to serve the attention economy. The buildings and the titles were still there, but their function had changed from solving problems to creating a spectacle.
And this content-managed reality just destroyed public trust, which brings us to the distrust dependence paradox.
Right, the legitimacy of all the big institutions, courts, media, universities, it was in free fall.
The hyper-awareness of 2025 meant people could see the biases, the financial incentives, the conflicts of interest inside these systems more clearly than ever before. So a deep skepticism set in.
But here's the paradox. Even with that almost universal distrust, people still had to depend on those exact same systems every single day.
This is such a critical insight into how broken systems survive. You might think the banking system is corrupt or the courts are biased.
Or that your utility company is screwing you over.
But you can't just opt out. You still need the roads to drive on. You need contracts to be enforced. You need the electricity to stay on.
So isn't that just pragmatism? If I need water, I have to deal with the water company. Where does it become a paradox?
The paradox sharpens because there are no viable alternatives. If there were a fully functioning alternative system for infrastructure or governance, you might see a real collapse and then a rebuilding.
But since there isn't one,
you're forced into this state of paradoxical obedience. You are actively obeying systems that you believe are fundamentally immoral, simply because you recognize that they are overwhelmingly powerful and necessary for your survival.
it's like political cognitive dissonance on a society-wide scale. Your belief that the system is powerful is stronger than your moral disgust that it's corrupt.
And living in that tension is psychologically exhausting, which, you'll notice, brings us right back to Section 1.
To burnout.
Exactly. If you believe the system is rigged, but you have to play the game just to keep your home and your job, all your energy goes into compliance, not disruption. The systems survive not because they're loved, but because they are deemed absolutely necessary for the minute-to-minute functioning of your life.
Speaking of survival, let's move to economics. The material calls it the abstract survival game. And the core feeling it describes is that the economy felt, well, completely unrelatable to daily life for most people.
The complexity had just become absolute. The line connecting, say, a central bank decision to the price you pay for milk had become so tangled and opaque that you couldn't trace it anymore.
It felt like it was all being driven by these invisible forces, high-frequency trading, quantitative easing, things that have no connection to tangible goods or local labor.
And that abstraction leads right into side hustles and systemic blame. With persistent inflation and job insecurity, the struggle to get by started to feel less like a systemic failure.
And more like a personal, moral failure.
Exactly. When you are struggling, but the headlines are all about record market growth and low unemployment, the dissonance is just agonizing. You start to think, well, the economy's doing great, so if I'm failing, it must be my fault.
It's a brilliant way to deflect blame away from the system. The game is presented as fair, so if you're losing, you must not be trying hard enough.
You saw the absurdity of it in the job market. Postings demanding 5 years of experience for a piece of software that came out 6 months ago. It just speaks to how disposable labor had become.
Right.
The system demands that you constantly retrain and reskill yourself just to stay in the exact same precarious place. It's a hostile moving target.
And that insecurity is what forced the side hustle to evolve. It went from being optional extra income.
To a primary survival identity.
It wasn't a hobby anymore.
No, for so many people, it was the reality. You weren't a salaried employee who also did some crafts on the side. You were a fragmented person, a contract coder, a weekend delivery driver, a freelance social media manager.
Just scraping together a patchwork of gig work to pay the rent.
Your identity itself became fragmented by economic necessity.
And the material notes this weird dynamic where being poor in 2025 was incredibly expensive.
Yes, the cost of inefficiency. You pay higher interest rates, you can't afford to buy in bulk, you can't afford the things that would actually stabilize your life like a reliable car. It keeps you precarious.
While at the same time, being ultra-rich was strangely anxious.
The anxiety of just unsustainable wealth concentration, the public scrutiny, plus the knowledge that their money was just abstract digital figures in untaxable structure, totally detached from any real-world economy.
And that brings us to the people who embodied that abstraction. Billionaires as mythical creatures.
The scale of their wealth was just so vast that they were operating on a completely different plane of existence. It wasn't just more money, it was a different reality with different rules. It became like characters from mythology.
And the visual contrast the material highlights is so powerful. You had billionaires focused on launching vanity space projects,
Colonizing Mars.
while back on Earth, the cities they lived in were literally decaying. Potholes, crumbling bridges, failing power grids.
It was such a staggering failure of imagination.
Yeah.
They had the capital and the engineering talent to solve profound earther problems, clean water, housing, infrastructure. But they chose to fund these boutique projects that would only benefit a tiny handful of people.
It just signals a complete detachment from the human condition. They were trying to solve problems that were literally not on this planet, while the basics here were falling apart.
And their public behavior reflected that distance. They'd go on podcasts and talk about humanity or civilization.
But with the clinical distance of zookeepers discussing an animal exhibit.
That's it. The language was so broad, so philosophical, intergenerational survival, but completely disconnected from the reality of the minimum wage or the cost of insulin. Their empathy was a performance. It was a PR requirement to maintain a moral sheen while running the very systems that created the distance in the first place.
They became avatars of optimization, not models of aspiration.
And that detachment from daily reality, it leads us right into the cultural landscape of 2025, especially around conflict. It was all about performance and a deep, deep moral inconsistency.
The first concept here is selective suffering and moral inconsistency. Global conflict was constant, but our attention to it was selective, algorithmic, and incredibly temporary.
You really have to look at the mechanics of attention. Outrage and focus didn't follow a consistent moral compass. They followed whatever the algorithm and cultural trends dictated.
So a conflict would erupt. It would become the absolute center of the cultural universe for, what, 3-4 weeks?
Right. It would generate huge emotional energy, online performances, all of it. And then with nothing actually resolved on the ground, it would just disappear from the feed.
It's the tragedy of the refresh button. As soon as a newer, shinier crisis emerges, the algorithm decides the old one isn't engaging anymore, and it gets retired from public view.
And this just reinforces the idea that our moral certainty is disposable. It changes faster than our actual behavior.
You could have two equally devastating conflicts happening at the same time. Conflict A, happening in a place that's culturally familiar to Western audiences, gets saturation coverage. We know the faces, we get the context.
But conflict B, maybe in a more complex or geographically distant region, gets almost nothing. Not because of malice, but because the algorithm decides it just won't perform as well. The engagement metrics aren't there.
The material puts it so bluntly. In 2025, suffering wasn't ignored, it was scheduled.
It was given a time slot, a finite window in the cultural consciousness before our attention was required elsewhere.
And that scheduling implies a kind of emotional management. We engage with the suffering when it's culturally required.
We perform the outrage, discharge the emotion, and then we're psychologically free to move on without any long-term commitment.
This whole climate of high-stakes moral performance led directly to this other shift, which the material calls identity as armor and brand.
Yes, this is where identity stops being a source of connection and becomes aggressively defensive.
Yeah.
It's used as armor, as a shield, as a brand you market in every interaction.
If you can just categorize yourself and, more importantly, categorize others quickly and definitively.
You streamline everything. You minimize social risk.
And disagreement gets treated as a personal attack, as a form of violence. So identity becomes this ultimate protective layer. If you criticize my idea, you're not attacking the idea, you're attacking me, my fundamental protected self.
And that defensive posture forces you to optimize your authenticity. It can't be messy or contradictory, which is what real people are. You have to present this curated, edited version of yourself that is perfectly legible and acceptable to your in-group.
It's all about approval optimization.
Which brings us to that brilliant, darkly funny insight from the material that in 2025, just having a sense of humor became a dangerous political position.
Because humor relies on ambiguity.
Exactly. It relies on context, on pushing boundaries, on discomfort. And if your identity is your armor, then ambiguity is a crack in that armor. It makes you vulnerable to being misunderstood or willfully misinterpreted.
So it was just safer to be serious, to be certain. Conformity became the optimized path.
And this optimization of identity also fueled the really strange phenomenon of vulnerability monetized.
This might be one of the most devastating parts of the whole analysis. The idea that personal pain and trauma stop being private experiences.
They became brand assets, things you needed for engagement.
Vulnerability wasn't just shared, it was marketed. You'd see people share these incredibly painful, traumatic stories. An illness, a family tragedy.
And it would come with a book deal or a line of merchandise linked to the experience.
T-shirts with slogans about a specific mental health struggle. Self-help tools branded with a survivor's story. The moment you monetize that struggle, its function changes. It's not about healing anymore.
No, it's about performance. And the pressure is on you to keep producing content from that trauma, which means the pain can never be private. It can never fully be resolved, because if it's resolved, the content stream dies. The brand asset loses its value.
Nothing felt private, especially not pain.
And if you put all these pieces together, the exhaustion, the automation, the content-managed politics, the monetized pain, you get to the deep, clarifying revelation of 2025.
Which is about where we look for the true source of harm. The analysis argues that most of the harm wasn't being driven by some evil mastermind in a secret room.
No.
It was driven by these deeply ingrained internal things. Conformity, skewed incentives, and the simple, overwhelming fear of standing alone.
And that's the moment the diagnosis gets crystal clear. We waste so much energy looking for a villain to blame. But 2025 showed that the systems don't need a villain. They just need widespread compliance.
The systems incentivize compliance over conscience.
That's the phrase. Your moral compass might tell you that the hiring algorithm is deeply unfair, but you have to use it to keep your job. That paycheck is a powerful, immediate incentive to just quiet down and comply.
So conformity becomes the quiet engine of injustice. It's not that people stopped caring about ethics.
Is that they didn't know how to act ethically inside structures that would immediately punish them for it. The risk of being labeled or fired or just cast out. That fear was enough to maintain the status quo, even when most people in it felt it was wrong.
Which takes us to the final, sobering assessment of the year. Awareness without resolution.
2025 was the diagnosis. It was not the cure.
We became this society that was incredibly well-informed, deeply emotional about all the problems, yet completely uncertain about how to translate that sharp awareness into any kind of meaningful, organized action. We could know all the problems, we understood the mechanisms of injustice.
But we hadn't figured out the slow, boring, collective work required to actually change the incentives that caused the problems in the first place.
It's a tragic paradox, isn't it? To be the most informed we've ever been and simultaneously the least capable of a coordinated response, the system had figured out how to absorb all that energy of dissent and turn it into profitable but ultimately harmless content.
But the legacy of that year is undeniable. The analysis ends with that powerful line: we can no longer claim we didn't see it.
That's it. The comfort of ignorance is gone. The cracks are visible to everyone. The blueprint of how the machine works has been revealed. The uncertainty now is what we do with that knowledge. It brings us right back to the beginning, to that psychological state of high awareness and low capacity. The next phase, the one that will determine if 2025 was a turning point or just a really loud, anxious year.
It's about finding the stamina. The stamina to move past the diagnosis and start the difficult, unglamorous work of building something new, something that incentivizes courage over compliance.
That feels like the only right place to leave it. What 2025 proved is that awareness is the first step. It's always the first step. But the challenge that remains is the big one.
The one everything hinges on.
Will all this awareness finally morph into difficult, coordinated courage and action? Or will it just degrade and become just another form of content?
A profound thought to leave you with, indeed.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.